All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics seminar series. This week, we are very fortunate and lucky to have Professor Valerie Luzadis from SUNY ESF, Environmental Sciences and Forestry. She is a former president of the U.S. Society of Ecological Economics, is well regarded and well known in the field of ecological economics, having published numerous articles. And, we're very, very fortunate and happy to have her today. So, with that, I'll just turn it over to you and thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, John. Well, I'm excited to be here today to take some time to share some ideas that are observations that have happened, been developing over a number of years. As I was saying as we were getting started here, I spent a fair amount of time in these last 15 or so years in academic administration and in leadership of other NGOs. And this has provided a lot of opportunity for observation, and a lot of what we're going to hear today comes from my thoughts around that and that have come out of this. So, given that I titled this talk Heart Forward Science, about engaging imagination, intuition, and intellect for solutions to confounding science and societal problems, I figured a good place to start would be a little bit of background about what this idea is and where it came from. So, as I was saying, over the course of my career, I have observed often that people in academic pursuits of science, economics, and policy have been constrained by these by often unspoken rules of what's allowed in terms of our focus, methods, ideas, and those sorts of things. I've also held a number of leadership positions in both higher ed and in NGOs. And as such, I seem to become a person that others would come to when they felt these constraints and were trying to figure out what do I do? How do I stay in this world and still be able to do the things that I feel are important? I've also had many experiences myself that didn't seem to fit within this dominant paradigm of Western science, which is the intellectual foundation of ecological economics. And yet they were super important to my work in terms of both what I was doing and the success of what I was doing. And I think that might have made me a little bit more open to hearing these concerns and supporting efforts to broaden scientific and economic thinking. So I began to see that there were aspects of ourselves that the strongly traditional Western science paradigm essentially didn't allow as part of our work. At first, I was thinking of this as sort of a head-heart kind of thing, which of course is now a really common idea in the world of business and other endeavors, having embraced this EQ or emotional intelligence idea as important. And eventually, as I started talking about this more, I began referring to these ideas as heart forward science. And it was not only in the administration of higher education or in the leadership of NGOs where I saw attention to these ideas were needed, but it was also squarely an issue in scholarly pursuits, originating from this foundation of Western science and Western thinking. So as I began talking more about it and using this term, heart forward science, I saw that every time I used those three words together that way, it got a reaction. So far, there have been really primarily three types of responses. The first is what I call a lean-in response. When I say those words, heart forward science, listeners almost always have had this physical reaction. They kind of lean toward me and say heart what science? Or what was that again? Often getting kind of, well, that sounds interesting, or I like the sound of that. They wanted to hear more. A second type of response was a more questioning one. And that was almost always from early and mid-career folks in science, sometimes further along, asking with a wariness, what is that? They've learned at that point to be careful in this world and with their words, knowing that there's a risk in challenging the dominant paradigm. And yet something in those words together, heart forward science, captured their attention and they wanted to know something more. The third response is pretty much the opposite of the lean in. It's more like the hand in the face, essentially responding with I would say, wariness or poo-pooing the idea and rejecting it out of hand, especially when the word intuition is used. And sometimes it's out and out disdain. And at least sometimes it comes with what appears to be an intent to discredit. So the usual response is that it's not possible to verify intuition, therefore it doesn't belong in the world of science. And I have learned through my own investigations that actually this isn't true in some other knowledge systems other than science. And this is where I really got into this interest in engaging multiple knowledge systems. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So in one of my most recent administrative gigs as Dean of the ESF Grad School, the vast majority of graduate students were extremely interested in and supportive of this articulation of both the need to change how we conduct science with greater equity and justice, and the notion of bringing all aspects of themselves to work. Now, that first bit, not very good words to use these days in some parts of the world. But the truth is that's what's been capturing the attention of a lot of the graduate students, especially in the world of environmental science. So one of the first times I shared this actually was at the USSEE National Convention Conference in 2013 when I was president. And I was amazed at that point by the positive response, especially of grad students at that time, when I suggested at just the beginning of these ideas that I wanted to develop a course that I called Engaging Intuition and Imagination for Solutions to Confounding Science and Societal Problems. That's where I got the name for my talk today, of course. And that was 12 years ago. So the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is really some of the ideas that have developed since then, and ideas that I think we can have a good conversation about to broaden our thinking. So heart-forward science. It's an approach in which we intentionally bring our whole selves to what we do. The foundational principles expand on science beyond an intellect-only endeavor by intentionally and explicitly bringing skills affiliated with both imagination and intuition into both the teaching and conduct of science. So Western science seeks to explain the world around us, and it does so by collecting and testing evidence. How this is done and the guidelines for it are passed down from generation to generation of scientists through modeling the process, and as such, it also passes down implicit bias, including scientific elitism. So there are, jumped ahead, sorry about that. So there are very two clear aspects or levels of heart-forward science. And one is at the individual level, and that includes self-knowledge and skills development. And the other is at an institutional level, looking at how we improve the ways in which we collectively do this thing together, how we organize to learn together and to live together. So I'm going to introduce more of this heart-forward science idea today by focusing on the broader endeavor of ecological economics to both introduce, illustrate, and demonstrate some of the principles of heart-forward science. But to start, what I want to do is ground us first in the tenets of ecological economics. So a quick AI Google search shows these as the tenets of ecological economics: prioritizing sustainable scale, ensuring fair distribution of resources, achieving efficient allocation, the initial first three, and the rest of these here, valuing natural capital, not necessarily valuation, recognizing ecological limits, integrating principles of ecological principles into economic analysis, and intergenerational equity. So I'll leave you all to grade that response from AI, but that gives us a base place to start. The aim of ecological economics overall, by the same source from the Google AI, was to promote human well-being within the constraints of Earth's ecosystems. Not too bad from what the overall endeavor has been. Well, I took all of this and I put it in terms of a vision for ecological economics from the perspective of this idea of heart-forward science. And I put it in these terms: our vision for ecological economics is building a more peaceful, equitable, and loving world to solve problems together through relationship with one another and nature. And this would involve collaborating across all perceived boundaries to resolve our most pressing issues of the day. And this third point, to have widespread and meaningful impact. Well, and maybe I should have added in this is understanding ourselves as nature rather than saying being in relationship with nature, because that's one of the things that would likely lead to changes in Western science, maybe more subtly than some other things. But these points reflect really two other ideas of ecological economics, both methodological pluralism and transdisciplinary efforts, which are central to the attention of ecological economists. So the third bullet point, though, that I list as a vision is primarily there because most ecological economists I know are not satisfied with the limited impact that our ideas have had. And that it's confounding to say, how is it possible with an aim of this endeavor of wanting to promote the well-being by living within the limits of Earth's ecosystems? Who could possibly argue with that? And yet, we've made relatively little headway refocusing this dominant paradigm of neoclassical economics to this end. The focal points of sustainable scale and just distribution, along with efficient allocation, have proven to be difficult to attract and sustain attention and intention. So not unlike the triple bottom line idea of people, planet, profit being a wonderful rhetoric that only goes beyond lip service when profit is attained, it's easy to understand the people and planet as subservient to profit in that situation. And so here we are with a truly triple bottom line, or the idea of that would be that we would have clear lines and boundaries that would be unacceptable with respect to both the people and planet ideas there, not just achieving as profit. So what I see here is that there's a fair amount of attention, but maybe without the requisite intention. So we're not having the impact we hoped for. So I'm going to really focus on that bullet today and really this idea, with the idea that heart-forward science ideas might be a means of achieving greater impact. Well, so before I get any further with that, I want to introduce a key idea of heart-forward science, and that is this keystone concept of relationship. It's key to meaningful engagement. And this is really about shifting from transactional interactions to relationship. And it changes not only the interaction itself, but it has positive and long-lasting ripple effects, both within the economy and society. And when we consider relationship beyond simply human to human and include humans as nature, it extends far beyond economy and society to Earth's ecosystems. Taking it another step further, it also includes our relationship with ourselves. It's a concept that has power at the individual and at the collective levels. So with this in mind, introductions are fundamental to developing a relationship. So we need to know one another, who we are and where we come from. So recently I was asked to contribute to a publication, and I was asked specifically to write an introduction of myself that allows the readers to know more of who I was and where I was coming from. And I found this to be a really valuable exercise for me too. So I'm going to introduce myself here right now this way, so that you can have a foundation and a context within which to hear what I have to offer today. So I'm a mother, a sister, a partner, a friend, and a citizen of Earth. And I come from a long line of master soup makers, natural gardeners, and wise women. I'm a woman scientist and policy practitioner working with a variety of social ecological systems, ecological economics, and at the science policy interface locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. My background is in forest science, adult communication and education, social ecological systems, and ecological and regenerative economics and policy. I've worked with NGOs throughout my career, serving in organizational and leadership positions in many and at all levels, local, state, national, and international. And I have served at nearly all levels of academic leadership as well, from department chair and grad dean to interim provost and executive vice president. My research and academic and organizational work is informed by systems thinking to enhance effectiveness and efficiency of institutions through inclusive, compassionate, and matrixed systems of shared effort, power, and respect for all. and I founded Heart Forward Science to support the development of holistic knowledge through a balance of intellect, imagination, and intuition to advance equitable, sustainable scientific outcomes. So let's jump into it. This discussion of greater impact on ecological economics. So as I was saying, it appears that I think we've not necessarily sustained the intention necessary to get there. So ecological economics, with its initial vision of sustainable scale, just distribution, along with efficient allocation, essentially declared itself as having an intention. And this is super interesting to me because the energy of intention is different than the energy of attention. And now, so many years after being drawn into this world of ecological economics, I can trace my own path to understanding that difference between attention and intention, and how they played a difference in a career based in Western science. Now, I'm going to leave that idea aside for the moment, and we'll come back to it a bit here and there. But just to say that the focus of what I share today are observations of the limitations of the ways in which we pursue knowledge in Western science, and share some ideas to consider how we might go beyond these limitations. So ecological economics, of course, has been at the forefront of transdisciplinarity, but it's primarily done this at the collective level. And it's time, I think, to adopt methods so that we achieve this at all levels. And a paper that I wrote with a team 15 years ago, where we looked at the first 15 years of papers in ecological economics. We did a content analysis of that. What we found is that the transdisciplinary character of ecological economics was found at the collective level, but not really identifiable at the individual level, individual paper level. That was a really interesting finding, as the initial intent of our content analysis was to assess the proportion of papers that demonstrated transdisciplinarity. So in the 15 years since, I'm not sure how much has changed or if enough has changed. And now we're at a point where public perception of science suffers even more now than at the time when engagement, at the time we did that study. And I have come to see that the way we conduct science has a lot to do with this. So a primary thesis of this talk today is that how we do what we do is as important as what we study. Respectful engagement of diverse knowledge systems or diverse knowledges provides the possibility of greater impact in Western science alone. And recognition of the power and the impact that this kind of research partnership brings forward is the possibility of healing a whole lot more than the environmental degradation and social degradation that are the concerns of the base of this. By expanding the scope of the problem to include systemic conditions, and I would say systemic conditions of violence and inequity resulting from a colonizer-settler mentality, we can achieve a much greater outcome through environmental research partnerships. This also provides the opportunity for a deep personal and professional level of fulfillment. Engaging diverse ways of knowing within ourselves. Intellect is just one. Imagination, intuition are others. And learning to do this, to know ourselves in these ways, allows ourselves to bring our whole selves to work in wildly impactful ways. So, how do we do this? I mean, one of the places to start is to begin with the acknowledgement and recognition that there have been limitations and historical injustices in the way in which Western science has conducted what it's done. This is not to say that there haven't been huge gains of information and knowledge within the Western world as a result of this, and within the global world as well, but it's a slice of what happens. And recognizing these limitations is a super important place to start. By acknowledging these things that were caused by what were often dualistic, elitist, and hierarchical power structures in Western science and policy, and also within the management that followed that. Once we open ourselves to seeing this, it provides us an opportunity to go beyond that. And it's not about condemning the past. It's about looking at things and saying, how can we do things better? It's about what can we do to have greater impact, to involve more people, to be able to have a greater sense of the collective working together to figure out how do we learn together and how do we live together in sustainable ways. And I'll go beyond that and say beyond just sustainable ways, but to in equitable and loving ways as well. So there's some other challenges with, and two, I would say, Western science approaches. They involve, both the communication and engagement. So ecological economics might have a leg up on some others with respect to a couple of these points, because as early adopters and purveyors of transdisciplinary approaches, right from the get-go, the idea of having people engaged in this was really an important aspect. So these points are really here as reminders, but that can be important when we're trying to think about what's going on in the world around us today and how we can continue to support each other in doing what we do. So following the dominant paradigms of science, though, we have to remember that our tendency is somehow often to take the stance of that we know something that others need to know without giving a lot of consideration to what they already know, or what they know in ways that we might not have considered. So a lot of environmental research happens with communities of all sorts, and many of these efforts are developed based on developing relationships really only deep enough for people to accept what we already know we have to offer, instead of being truly collaborative, participatory, and flexible from the start. We come from a tradition in which we've learned to be the experts, to tell, to profess, to compare, to direct, to persuade, all amounting to essentially unidirectional communication aimed at our quote unquote partners. So we listen enough to make our own points instead of empathetically listening to deeply understand and then co-create the best ways forward. Engaging communities as subjects of study isn't partnership. So practicing intellectual humility, empathetic listening, and engaging in co-creation and co-production of knowledge are hallmarks of these respectful interactions based on relational foundations rather than transactional bases. I'm having trouble moving the slide. Give me a second. As soon as I can move the slide ahead, I will do that. Oh, okay. It seems I have completely moved the slides. Sorry about that. We'll get right back to slides here in a second. Take me just 1 minute to get that screen I need. I'm not sure what happened there. Well, this gives you a minute as I pull this up to be thinking about what some of these things are, some questions that you might have as we go. So I'm pulling the PowerPoint back up and we'll be with you in just a minute. Okay, here we are. Ready to share. John, can you confirm that you're seeing the slides again now?
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right, sorry about that, everyone. A little break in the middle. All right, so we're picking up with this idea of practicing intellectual humility, empathetic listening, and engaging in co-creation and co-production of knowledge as the hallmarks of respectful interactions. And so I've been thinking about this as where are these inflection points? And a few years ago, I thought maybe we were at one. When the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements came up, I was thinking perhaps this is a time when we might actually have a sea change of how we're doing what we're doing. Well, we collectively chose to look a different way and pass that by. But at the time, those moments stimulated a lot of us to begin and to further our efforts on a path toward an equitable world, a more equitable world. And these movements created opportunities, lots of opportunities for us and support for us to do our own individual level work to see and to unlearn the long-standing, really oppressive structures and systems that came out of our colonizing history. And it pointed to this need to unlearn as a crucial part of this process. So recognizing that we're steeped in these structures and starting to look at them along with what we're doing. So it's not just, again, what we're doing, it's a how we do it. And these structures we're within. This is once we get open to see this, it allows us the opportunity to be able to do things differently. Now, sometimes this comes with backlash or backsliding, and that's where the sand dune idea came in here. So you think about a lot of these ideas of trying to make change in big systems and in organizations and in society is often like climbing a sand dune, where you take one step up and you slide back a little bit. So if you've ever done that, you know that idea. You step, you slide back, you step, you get a little further, slide back. For every step you take, you slide back a little bit, but there is eventually progress, and you eventually get to the point that you're hoping to get to. So I'll say the power dynamics that we see institutionally in a lot of this also tends to be replicated at the individual level. So we see among us the haves and have-nots with gender, race, orientation, and identities. And that means that each of us can find ways to move in the world in ways that do not replicate these kinds of damages. So following a path of individual awareness, empathetic listening, acknowledgement, healing, unlearning, learning new things, and co-creating a transformed future helps not only at the individual level, but it creates a ripple effect that actually carries that effect much further. So think about it. Everyone I know has had a situation where you've been in a room and someone walks in and they are incredibly joyful. Something just fantastic has happened. They walk in, they're bubbling over with this energy. And we get that energy too. We feel it. It lifts us up. We feel that. We all know that. And that's what happens when we engage in something and do this differently in these ways. Others feel it. And that's part of that ripple effect. And it goes well beyond the very detail of what we're doing. So supporting each other in doing this and getting to this point of reframing and refocusing becomes really important. So engaging with differing knowledge systems with respect is really important because it's got the potential to bring so many more people into this process with us, in this idea of working together to figure out how do we learn what we need to learn and how do we live together sustainably and peacefully and sustainably. Doing these things in a way in which we allow people to bring what they have to bring to the table is super important. So most science and environmental research programs don't really address the role of imagination, consciousness, intuition, and science, or in ways of knowing beyond the analytical and the intellectual, nor do they teach the skills that are necessary to engage intuition as well as intellect, to effectively interweave them. And it's a combination that results not only in solutions that reflect diversity in so many ways, but it also welcomes so many more people to contribute, no matter what their level of scientific education. So imagine a partnership that's designed to allow for the emergence of new ideas from anyone within the group. We may believe that we're offering this simply by calling an association a partnership, but it's not so without explicitly designing and operating in ways that support every participant to bring their full selves and their ways of knowing to the endeavor, and to be not only allowed, but encouraged and supported by design for everyone to fully contribute. Inviting others into our world with the condition that they accept and abide by our rules doesn't adequately address these issues. So an example of that is that in recent years, Western science has done just that, making what I would call an arguably weak effort to recognize indigenous knowledges by doing just that. Come join us, talk to us in our place, in our ways, in our time, in our language, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think that's any way to really invite, and that's not a respectful way to invite, and we can do better. So while I'm not going to fully dive into this in this particular talk, a lot of what I'm talking about here invites needs for changes of how we teach what we teach and how we teach how to conduct science. And it's time, I think, that we openly acknowledge that intellect is simply one component necessary and used in good and impactful science. So I could do a whole talk on intuition, how it does and can play a role in science. I'm just introducing the idea here. And I've written a short paper actually on using the techniques in the classroom, and I can share that if people would like. But the key today is this idea, to openly engage in dialogue about this and about how it can improve what we do in our scientific scholarly work. So over the course of my career, I really have watched and listened as scientists and economists and trained in Western science foundations discount intuition or knowledge that they can't explain the origins of. And the most easiest example of that, of course, is indigenous science or wisdom. And without recognizing that they're applying the ideas of Western science to a different kind of knowledge system. I don't know one person in science or economics trained in Western science from those foundations who would not be able to tell the difference between something that comes to them intuitively and their evidence-based work. So that's not a question of that. So we really need to dig in and say, what are we talking about here? So the question becomes where and how can intuition fit within this world of science and scholarly pursuit of knowledge? And we can ask this about ecological economics. So if we had time today, this would be a great time to stop and talk and talk about intuition and really do, what is it? How do you know what it is? How do you know it's that? How do we develop skills to discern and to use it in service to whatever the endeavor is? Add imagination to this, although this we're more comfortable with talking about. Sociologists now are using imaginaries pretty frequently in their work and publishing about it. And we use scenario development that sometimes goes beyond data, trends, engaging imagination and maybe intuition, although not named that way, and to consider the future. So some of this work is closely linked with bringing in creativity, the world of science, to problem solving, design, and especially when we're addressing wicked problems that lack clarity, face constraints, are often incomplete, have changing, and they're contradictory, have changing conditions and all. So we can do that another time, engage together in a more participatory way about those ideas. But for now, I'll posit that intentionally engaging with imagination and intuition, in addition to intellect, provides pathways that have the potential to take us to new approaches and solutions, jumping us out of any paradigm traps that we might be in. And yes, I'm referencing Kuhn here with the idea of revolution, remembering that we get stuck in paradigms in Western science that often limit the questions we allow ourselves to ask and how we go about doing so. Or perhaps it's a situation of a complex system with multiple equilibria, and going beyond the limits of a paradigm jumps us into a different equilibrium, different ways of thinking about this. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about engaging multiple knowledge systems. So considering how we do this, these ideas reflect primarily doing this on a collective level. And we can, again, it could be a separate talk to think about how do we do this at an individual level. So what is needed? Engaging diverse knowledge systems respectfully requires self-confidence with humility and humanity as we consider who is involved, who owns the outcomes, and how we can collaborate in truly equitable ways. And that requires self-knowledge. It's no longer enough to bring only our analytical, intellectual selves to this work. We must bring our whole selves to all that we do. And this is what I call engaging with heart. Learning, embracing the many ways in which we know, extending beyond the analytical and intellectual. Learning to intertwine it all to inform our actions can be described as thinking with our heart and feeling with our minds. Many of you might have heard that paradoxical way of stating this. But the results are impactful, they're compassionate, humble, and respectful. This also takes us back to that idea of unlearning as a principle. We really need to think about what are the things that we've held on to for a long time that we need to let go in order to make space for and bring in new ideas. So we always in science have focused on what's the next best hypothesis, theory, construct. So that's kind of a natural idea, is that, okay, we go to the next thing. And that also means letting go of some things. And so the way in which we teach about this, we know, has morphed over time. And of course, it varies by professor, by program, by institution. But as we continue to seek hypotheses, theories, and constructs that better serve us, examining whether and how we replicate patterns and structures that don't serve us makes complete sense. So the question is, are we doing that? And how do we do that? And so remembering and recognizing that we're steeped in structures that we've carried forward from the past is just an initial start. And it does require multi-level and multi-scale observations to achieve the attention and intention of a world of sustainable scale, just distribution, and efficient allocation. So we really do need to think about all of these things and practicing what I put here as HFS, my, of course, heart forward science. So it really does involve this unlearning these ingrained ways that replicate what we want and recognizing that. And practicing intellectual humility, seeing embedded impression and inequities is really important. And again, I understand it is not fashionable to say some of these things today. And I will say today in some parts of the world. But the reality is we have moved forward in a way that we are already paying attention to these things. And if we want to find other words and do other ways and think about this, we're moving forward with this one way or another, because that's what's being called for in the world. So developing these new approaches, well, I was going to say, we can think of this actually as heterogeneity mattering. As we know, when we think about complex systems and the collapse of systems over time, that heterogeneity is a super important concept for sustainability over a wide scale. And developing new approaches, the emergence of novelty within systems as we understand evolution to work. And openly engaging with heart is one of the ways we can move toward some of these ideas. So I wanted to share an example of what I would call heart forward science in action. And it's now in a form of a book called Transforming Global Health Partnerships. It was edited by Anna Stewart-Ibarra and Desiree Laborde, and it's about global health partnerships, but it applies to anyone practicing in any kind of partnership or collaboration or transdisciplinary effort. It's an open access book. There were 90 authors from 20 countries, and it's got wonderful examples of how these ideas were put to work in different kinds of local, multinational, all different levels in terms of how to conduct with these ideas in mind. And it provides, as such, sort of this roadmap to how to do these sorts of things for equitable, sustainable, impactful partnerships by interweaving of voices. It involves, since with these 90 authors from 26 countries, that's North and South, and it's really focusing on stories that need to be told, and both successes and failures that allow us to have a vision for a healthier and more compassionate future for humanity. So at this point, I'm going to stop here. I have been thinking about this idea for a while. I'm working on putting these ideas into a book to be able to share in that way. Would love to provide opportunities to talk with people further about this and to workshop the ideas further. And I'm doing a little bit of consulting related to it as well. But I'm going to stop here, say thank you for this opportunity to share ideas, and would love to hear from you in terms of your thoughts about all of this.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting and thought-provoking. We have a question in the chat by Alejandro. Alejandro, you want to go ahead and ask?
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Valerie, for that interesting and inspiring presentation. I'm just sharing with you and everybody, and perhaps this is something that you actually know, that philosophers of science acknowledge the role of intuition and imagination in the type of inference called retroduction, which is, and I like to quote one of my favorite philosophers of science, Norwood Hansen, primarily a search for intelligibility. Only secondarily is it a search for objects and facts, though the two endeavors are as hand in glove, he says, in this interesting book, Patterns of Discovery, an inquiry into the conceptual foundations of science. Have you heard about him or have you heard about retroduction? Sometimes it's also called abduction. But well, there is a philosophical debate about which terminology is more appropriate.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your putting that here. I'm happy to hear about all of these things, but I'll tell you that the way in which I have gone about doing what I'm doing is actually following my own experience in the world. And mostly what I'm sharing is observations of my experiences in the world. I've only touched the tip of the iceberg with that. I have not said a lot about the experiences I have had. So one of the things I've done is I have not gone into the science of intuition, because that's not what my endeavor is. My idea is to bring ideas forward in terms of how we can think about it further. So having these editions like this in conversations like this is perfect. Everybody brings what they have. So Alejandro, thank you very much for sharing this, because it's fantastic that there is support for this in other areas as well. Yeah, that's
Thanks for
wonderful.
the clarification. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
So I will just, while we're waiting to see if there are any others, I'll just say it would be super helpful for me to hear whatever your thoughts are on this. Because as you see, this is kind of first time out of the gates having a full conversation around this, or having an opportunity to talk a little bit about it this way. And so I would welcome any feedback, including weak points and areas where you feel like it would be a better way of presenting, or ideas that you just think I'm completely out to lunch on. So I'm open to it all, please.
May I go again?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, John. Just a little thing, Valerie. Look, there is something called use mention mistakes, which is confusing the reality we describe with the language we use to describe it. And I have the impression that perhaps in Europe, thanks to Michel Foucault, in France, among others, we have gone too far in the process of keep talking about the figurative language we use to describe reality instead of reality itself, and that's a point of the use mention mistakes. My point is then, is it any hope to build intersubjective agreement over what we are talking about if we go too far in the way of intuition and emotions, if we try to meet indigenous knowledge in its own terms? What is the hope of building that intersubjective agreement about what we are talking about?
Yeah, so the idea of intersubject agreement is coming from one of those knowledge systems. And so there's a real problem when we try to apply one way of thinking to multiple ways of thinking. And so it doesn't necessarily apply. So what it requires is relationship. It requires us to know who we're engaging with and enough about their knowledge systems to be able to be willing to work with other ways of knowing. So it's never going to come down to our way of determining, yep, this is okay, because our way in Western science is specific to Western science. And that's one of those limitations. Does that make sense, Alejandro? Do what I'm saying?
Yes, yes. It's thought provoking. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. And this is something I've seen this over and over again, primarily with engagements with indigenous scientists, where Western scientists will say, well, how do you know what you know? You have to explain to us how you know what you know. And that's offensive to the people that I've worked with, and in a deep way. And what I literally stepped out of the world of academia and I stepped into the world of a mystery school, and we can talk about this separately, where I spent years learning a different type of knowledge system in which I now personally know that intuitive knowledge is actually verifiable by someone else, not in Western science terms, but in other terms. And that might be a conversation for yet another talk at another time. But this is where I'm talking about where we can't use one system to measure against another.
Thank you.
Luca, go ahead.
Hi. Oops. Oh, my camera is still okay. Yeah.
It's on, you're just not in it.
Okay. Yeah. Just changing the camera. So yeah, that's it. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for these these thoughts. I was just wondering. I agree that in Western science there's a lack of some of like dealing with indigenous knowledge, or to deal with other, like how other methods. But I still wondering I think at least it is also important to have some standard, or to think of. I mean, that's of course that's something science. Like if I think of science, or if others think of science, okay, we have induction or deduction, some methods, some Occam's razor, and so on. And these are all kind of some standardized mechanisms to infer to infer something from the reality, condense the reality, or to have something. And I still was wondering. Of course, if you dive into other things, then it's hard, because I guess then maybe that's not what you define as standard science. If you think of like mystery things or something, of course, what I am thinking is also to, if we are thinking of like the relationship with nature or something like sustainability, we have to expand like these standard thinking maybe, and go into more like having like some like religious in religious terms, or something to get to feel that you are connected to nature or something. And there's maybe something more than these standard way of thinking, if to convince people for transformative actions and so on. But yeah, still I was wondering how to can we bring this together without getting out of some like to jump out, basically out of the car, or I don't know. Something.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and this idea of standards, and how can we rely on this, and how can we know? I think those are really, really important questions in all of this. And I don't have all the answers. I have ideas, but I think part of the point of this is to co-create that, to co-produce that we have to think together. We have to not only think together, we have to think together, we have to feel together, we have to understand together. And as we do that, I've been thinking about this part for a while, that a while back I put a paper together with a colleague, Paul Hirsch, on this very idea of when we start to look at complex problems, when we apply very narrow ideas about how we measure the veracity of something, it doesn't work with bringing together multiple disciplines either. And so we have to come up with these confounding problems. We need to find a way to figure out what can we have confidence in, and why, and how. And so that's one of the things that we really need to pay attention to. That's one of the questions that I think we need to resolve. And I'm not sure we haven't really taken that on. What we've done is just not looked. And I'm suggesting that it's important for us to look because we can stay in our relatively narrow track, and there's plenty of stuff that we can learn about and continue to learn about in detail. The question is, when we're coming to thinking about how to live together sustainably over the long term, we can't do that alone. We have to do that together. So how do we do it together? And part of it might be trying to figure out, what is that standard across systems? How do we know that? And I think that would be a fantastic endeavor and a really important set of questions to start thinking about.
Yeah. Just like an example come to my mind, like in Chinese medicine, I've had a talk with they have these principle of qi, basically, which is qigong and like some tai chi and so on. They are related to this concept, and it's interesting because like also the Western medicine is very like restricted in some sense, that we have like all these conventions and all these different disciplines, but not the holistic thinking. And that it's actually what is present in Chinese medicine. They have really another standard, but so it's some kind of other science we can think of that. And still, these two things are valid somehow, but we in our Western thinking missed some kind of the complexity or the system. So yeah, that is, I think the idea you are or what you are telling about is, yeah, somehow maybe this is an example.
Yeah, it's a great example of that, to think about. So how do we do that? And yeah, we figure it out as we go, right? I'm not here to present all the answers, but really to ask the questions at this point and to try to stimulate some thinking about it. Yeah, great ideas.
I'd like to visit the concept of intuition, in the sense of, it seems to me that it's more of a, I'll say recent, last 50 years or so, that intuition's kind of been pushed, like, no, we can't go with intuition. Because it seems to me a lot of the great finds, the great thoughts were intuition based. And, if you're working with data sets or something and you're working with them a lot, you know what the numbers are going to do. You know what the numbers are going to say. And I think intuition plays a key role. And so I think it's great that you're bringing this aspect forward, because how many of the great finds in history were intuition based, and why have we got away from that?
So John, that's it. So I actually had that in here, took it out of the talk and thought we'll wait till another time. But the only time we ever hear about this is when somebody's won a Nobel award or something, and this happened when they woke up from a dream where they saw such and such, and then it was or whatever it was. There's stories, there are books about that you can find. And why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about what is that role? And it seemed like it's kind of a fear-based reaction to say, oh no, we can't talk about that because I don't know why, because that's one of the things that's stumped me. But I agree that I think when we look back and we look at some of these great finds, as you say, there's often a story that would link to some sort of direct knowledge, some way, whatever that means. And there are plenty of people who study intuition as their subject of study. And again, I'm not stepping into that realm to do that. I'm saying, as somebody who doesn't do this, what do we do? Sarah. Yes, I wondered if this would come up in preparation for this talk. Do you want to jump on?
Sure. Your words really resonate with me. I have thought a lot about weaving knowledge systems and bringing in Indigenous partners to co-create research outputs as well as outputs useful to their communities as well as academic outputs. I think what you're saying about intuition is really important. However, I can't help but think about how intuition can be used in ways that honestly violate some of my core values and principles. And I think, our current US president I don't think he's got some deep strategy. I feel like he's just making like intuitive decision after intuitive decision based on a very transactional understanding of how people operate in a reciprocity kind of relationships that's very transactional. And I just can't help but think that we also need guardrails on empowering intuition. It can't be just intuition. It's going to be intuition combined with other ways of knowing.
Yep, the intertwining, right? That's why the intertwining of the three for me is really key. And I think what you say, Sarah, is a huge, huge thing. And historically, I will say, if you look at the passing on of esoteric knowledge from generation to generation, it has been guarded carefully for this very reason, for this whole idea of the potential of misuse of the power that comes with that. Because what this is all predicated on is this idea that power over is not what we're after, but it is a principle of autonomy and personal power and power together and with as a collective. And and this is really an interesting thing. So, Allison, I want you to jump into this conversation too, especially with this idea of intuition being skewed.
Cool. Hi. Sorry, I'm not going to do my video right now. So I'm reading this book right now. I'm a parent, and it's called Hold On to Your Kids: Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. Gordon Neufeld wrote it, and Gabor Mate actually helped him. I love that guy. It was published in 2000. Well, I guess my edition was 2006. So, it's 20 years old. But I will say that his theory really resonates, especially with what Sarah just mentioned. So what we're seeing in politics, and I mean, it's interesting because these are adults, right? But all adults started as children. And so when we see children orienting towards their peers, say on the playground, they're very malleable, and they will make decisions depending on what their peers are doing, right? And so then Gordon Neufeld says that this is a child that has become peer oriented. And so that child is operating from this place of what his peers are doing and thinking, and how he will be perceived by his peers, instead of operating from a place of like, okay, I'm oriented to my family. I'm oriented to the land that I live on. I'm oriented to the ecosystem that I live within, right? It's that whole concept. And so, and Gordon Neufeld in this book, his first chapter, he's like, look, our political system is being run by a bunch of peer-oriented people. And so what that means is that their intuition is skewed because they're not operating from this place of a holistic perspective that is looking at a long-term timeline, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's a super important point, and it really does follow on what Sarah was talking about too, that I would say that that's not operating from intuition. It's operating from some other basis. And so, again, the words of how you say either way, it's problematic. And that's super important in terms of how do we go forward with this? But this is a big part of it, is figuring out, are there guardrails? And that's where, again, I came back to this intertwining idea of intertwining of these things of intellect and intuition and imagination. And I kind of think of as imagination as another third part of all of this, but so it can't be either or, but that's as far as I've gotten with it. And again, the idea of this is to open the conversation. So thank you so much for these great thoughts. Out of time, I think.
Yeah, we're just gonna wrap up here. Before I close things out, just want to remind everybody that next week is our next seminar. It's by Sam Purkis. He's an expert in the field of coral reef conservation, University of Miami, and he's also chief scientist for Living Oceans Foundation. He's been on a variety of documentaries and television shows regarding the topic. And then the 28th, we will follow that up with an economics talk on coral reefs by Kirsten Olesen. Also want to just put out there quickly, put a save a date in your calendars for June 24th, June 9th through the 11th for the first ever USSEE workshop. It will be on, we don't have a title yet, but it's on ecological economics education. And it'll be on three particular topics of energy, environmental justice, and macroecological economics. So please put that on your calendars, and hopefully many of you will participate. Before we go, just want to thank you again, Valerie, for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. Very interesting. And just thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Well, thanks, everybody. Have a nice weekend.